free speech has basically, there's a ton of free speech out there. We've probably never had as much free speech in terms of volume on the internet, on political platforms, demonstrations happening virtually on a weekly basis in the centre of London. The one today, organised by the far right. There's a counter one as well. But is the problem that actually the free speech has also become more and more hateful speech, and that's what people are reacting to?
Yeah, I mean, the free speech debate, other than the absolutists that believe in absolute free speech, which is a very small minority, has always been a question of where is the line between acceptable and unacceptable speech. And clearly in the age of social media, many people whose voices would have traditionally been marginalised throughout the whole post-war period because they were extreme, and as such they wouldn't have been allowed on television, they wouldn't have been platformed on the radio or given columns in newspapers. In the age of social media, the most extreme individuals in our society can now reach hundreds of thousands, or in many cases now even millions and millions of people. And so if the social media platforms, for example, do end up with an absolutist American-style attitude towards the First Amendment, like X under Elon Musk, then we do see very, very extreme voices reaching millions and millions of people in a way that was much more difficult some decades ago.
Okay, so for instance, an example, Charlie Kirk said lots of things that many people found very offensive, and he said lots of things that, many more people probably agreed with. But one of the things, for instance, was, and I quote, "Islam is the sword with which the radical left is slicing the neck of America, cutting the throat of America." Is that hate speech or is that free speech?
Well, I mean, I preface all of this by saying no matter what he said, it's completely appalling what happened to him, and there's never any excuse for political violence. But I think there's lots of people that have been talking about Charlie Kirk in the last week as though he was a relatively mainstream figure. We saw Boris Johnson talk about him as though he was espousing generally mainstream or just slightly conservative views. He espoused many, many extreme views that I think would sit comfortably in any academic definition of the far right, and regularly did cross the line into what would be deemed as hate speech, certainly under British definitions of it.
Right. And do you think that we are becoming Americanized in the sense that we're opening the door to speech that once upon a time would have been deemed unacceptable, both from the right and the left?
Yeah, I do actually, and I think this is just perhaps a symptom of us living in a globalized world in the digital age. But I think increasingly the free speech debate in Britain does look more American in style. And of course, in America, they have a very different tradition of free speech than we do, perhaps in Britain and large parts of Europe, which is they have the First Amendment. In many ways, that is the first right. It is the most fundamental right. Whereas I think traditionally in Britain, going back many, many decades or even hundreds of years, free speech, although very fundamental in Britain, has been one of a number of competing rights. And so people also have a right not to be attacked, not to be abused, not to be racially abused, etc. And those rights compete, and we have a discussion and a societal debate about where those lines should be. Increasingly, I feel we're shifting to a much more American style, where any discussion about putting parameters around acceptable and unacceptable speech in our society is somehow now criticised as a wild enemy of the free speech. We saw Nigel Farage coming along these sorts of lines when he addressed the American Senate recently in a committee about the Online Safety Act. These debates now have shifted fundamentally, where all of a sudden the universal attitude towards free speech is that there should be almost no parameters put around what's acceptable. British society is far more like the American debate than it was previously in the UK. And I think that comes with dangerous consequences, and we're seeing the result of that today, where we're very likely to see on the streets of London perhaps the largest ever far-right demonstration in British history, led by Tommy Robinson. And Tommy Robinson is a great example of a figure that, because he has been platformed by major social media platforms and been able to reach tens or hundreds of millions of people with his content over the years, he's having a radicalizing effect on sections of British society. And if you really believe in free speech, if you really believe that we should have a fundamentally public square on our social media, for example, then you have to understand that if you allow a completely laissez-faire attitude to what can be on that platform, then people self-censor. Women remove themselves from the platform because they don't want to receive death threats. People of colour in the Muslim community remove themselves from X because they are tired of getting racially abused every day. And you actually end up with far fewer voices, a less pluralistic debate. So ironically, the people that most demand free speech as this universal, vast, important right often end up creating debate which actually limits the number of voices that are involved.